I think of the title. And I go around telling everyone I'm going to write a book by that name. And then one day I write the title. I put Dame Muriel Spark under it. And I turn the page and I write chapter 1, and then I write the first sentence, and then I go on from there. Really, that's how it is.
Muriel Spark was a unique voice in 20th century literature. By the time of her death in 2006, she had published 22 novels, as well as poetry, essays, and biography. Her pen was unerringly sharp, observant, funny, often uncomfortably true. Her writing is unmistakable.
I'm drawn to her daring, not only in her fiction, but in the way that she conducted her life.
She transformed herself from schoolgirl poet to celebrated woman of letters. It was a journey of perpetual reinvention and escape, from colonial Africa to wartime London. From the heart of literary New York to elegant 1960s Rome, there was no one quite like her. In this, her centenary year, Muriel Spark has been celebrated in the city of her birth. But how well do we really know her? I want to piece together the story of her life through her writing, her personal papers, and a wealth of BBC archive that spans more than 40 years. Contemporary writers will add their voice to the story. And I'll travel to Italy.
Oh, hello.
To meet the woman Muriel lived with for 30 years. She has agreed to speak for the first time on camera to share her insights into the Muriel she knew. Muriel Sarah Camberg was born in Edinburgh on the 1st of February 1918. The world was on the brink of change. The First World War was almost over. Women were about to get the vote. Muriel's father was a Jewish Scot and her mother was English. The Cambergs lived in a flat in Bruntsfield Place.
My mother never stopped talking and telling me stories of her girlhood. My father was very amusing. He would sing and dance, and they were as good as they possibly could afford to be.
From the family home, it's just a short walk to the place where Muriel's writing talent was first recognised.
In the 1930s, this building was home to James Gillespie School for Girls, where the middle class of Edinburgh sent their daughters for a genteel grammar school education. Muriel was cherished here as the poet and dreamer, and she later said that these were the most formative years of her life. It was here, at the age of 11, that Muriel Spark was to meet the woman who would have a profound effect on her life. Her teacher, Miss Christina Kay, was the prototype of Miss Jean Brodie. Muriel said at the time, "She entered my imagination immediately."
Regard the Mona Lisa. She is older than the rocks on which she sits. Whom did I say to regard? Clara.
The Mona Lisa, Miss Brodie.
That is correct. Clara has artistic tendencies.
Although Miss Kay entered her imagination immediately, Muriel would publish 5 novels before she created the iconic figure of Miss Jean Brodie. Muriel reflected in her autobiography,
"In a sense, Miss Kay was nothing like Miss Brodie. If she could have met Miss Brodie, Miss Kay would have put the fictional character firmly in her place. And yet, no pupil of Miss Kay's has failed to recognise her, with joy and great nostalgia, in the shape of Miss Jean Brodie in her prime."
How accurate was that a picture of an Edinburgh that you knew?
Well, as Edinburgh, it was as accurate as I could remember, touched up for fiction. My school was, it really was happier. It wouldn't have made a good novel.
Edinburgh in the 1920s was a very grey place, I imagine. It was a very grey place in the 1950s, so it must have been very, very grey in the 1920s. She used to say of the film of the Prime Minister Jean Brodie that the biggest problem was that it made Edinburgh look too bright.
Anyone who expects Jean Brodie to be a gentle account of an Edinburgh girlhood will find a surprising amount of darkness.
When she writes her characters, there's no such thing as someone who's just delightful all the way through. When I first read Prime Minister Jean Brodie, I thought I was supposed to like her because she was the heroine, and I was very confused in that she was so sharp and unpleasant. There was a lot of stuff that was really quite questionable.
This is a large formation of Il Duce's fascisti. They are following him in noble destiny. I myself mingled with such a crowd. I wore my silk dress with red poppies, which is right for my colouring.
She's kind of a very charismatic teacher. She's completely delusional, which is beautifully, gradually released. And she's trying to create girls in her image, and even slightly sort of pimping one of them. I mean, she's a terrible, terrible woman, but she is much beloved by these very impressionable young women. But it's a portrait of somebody going morally and intellectually completely wrong.
I read The Prime Minister Jean Brodie first when I was 17, a schoolgirl myself. It's about a teacher whose educative faculty is so seductive that it makes the people who are under her wing bloom. And then, as you're reading through it, you realise that the attractions and the seductions which are working in this book, which are the attractions of exclusion and inclusion, because the Brodie set is absolutely a set. And then you've got the one member of the Brodie set who's not really a member of the set, Mary McGregor, who's sort of on the outside so that the set can be a set. So as you're reading it, and you're 17, and suddenly the workings of your own social mode, society, are revealed to you just in the classroom, so that all your seductions that you've ever felt towards a belief, a person, an authority system, come into play in a novel which is so fast and light and funny and attractive.
It is well when in difficulties to say never a word, neither black nor white. Speech is silver, but silence is golden. Mary, are you listening? What was I saying? Mary McGregor, lumpy with merely 2 eyes, a mouth and a nose like a snowman, who was later famous for being stupid and always to blame, and who at the age of 23 lost her life in a hotel fire, ventured, golden? What did I say was golden? Mary cast her eyes around her and up above. Sandy whispered, "The falling leaves." "The falling leaves?" said Mary. "Plainly," said Miss Brodie, "you were not listening. If only you small girls would listen to me, I would make of you the creme de la creme."
Here was a young writer writing in a way that was very dry, very kind of mordant and cruel in a way, which didn't seem to fit the persona of the author at all. But you see that throughout her work, and it's something I think that she maybe inhabited naturally or realised it worked and continued with it. But she's an extraordinary writer in the sense that the 22 novels she wrote all seem filtered through this particular literary tone of voice. Short sentences, very pithy, very dark, cruel things are funny, good people get punished.
For the first 18 years of Muriel Spark's life, Edinburgh was her world, and it stayed with her.
Edinburgh is a kind of character in my mind, much more than any other city. It has a peculiar stamp and a set of morals, a set of ideas, all its own. It's very puritanical, or was. I don't know if it still is, but when I hear an Edinburgh accent, I get a whiff of the morals that go with it. I knew that sooner or later I would have to go because most people did, you know. I didn't see where I would fit in Edinburgh at all. Besides, I wanted to travel.
By 1937, some of my friends were getting engaged and married. I longed to leave Edinburgh and see the world. Perhaps that is why I got engaged to Sydney Oswald Spark. I had met him at a dance. I don't know exactly why I married this man rather than any of the younger boyfriends who took me to dances. It was a disastrous choice.
Well, in those days, it was the only way you could have a life. Young girls in my position could never have any sex. It just was unthinkable. I never met a man who would have gone to bed with me. Nice girls didn't do that sort of thing. I wanted a nice life of my own, plenty of sex, plenty of fun. But I didn't get it, actually. It was a mistake.
In Sydney Oswald Spark, she saw an intelligent man who was 13 years her senior. He had been offered a teaching job in southern Rhodesia. Muriel was tempted by the promise that she would not have to do any housework in Africa and would have plenty of time to write. And so, at the age of 19, Muriel set off to join him.
It was the 13th of August 1937 when, alone for the first time in my life, I sailed on the Windsor Castle to Cape Town, the first lap of my journey.
Muriel Camberg would be no more. She was full of hope for her new life as Mrs. Muriel Spark.
Muriel Spark always said that she felt Scottish by formation, but it was in Africa where she learned to cope with life.
I think it must have been really difficult for Muriel Spark to move to Africa aged 19, 20. I mean, I was born in Africa and grew up there, so I was completely at home in the country. It was more familiar to me than Edinburgh or anywhere else. Whereas Muriel Spark coming from Edinburgh to what was then Rhodesia, it must have been a profound shock for her.
Barely 2 months after they were married, Muriel found out she was pregnant.
When I was expecting a baby, my husband suggested very earnestly that I have an abortion. He was beginning to feel uneasy and unstable. I refused.
Her son Robin was born on the 9th of July in 1938. Muriel was just 20 years old, 8,000 miles from home, and no one really to support her. She'd married a man whom she barely knew, who had a long history of mental illness, and who could not control his moods, nor his temper. Muriel's life here became increasingly precarious. Her husband just could not hold on to a job, and at first she did everything she could to support him. She brought him here to the Victoria Falls, thinking it would lift his spirits. Instead, it had a profound effect on her.
Somewhere down the river, does the hush become a sibilance that hints a sigh, a murmur, mounting as the currents rush faster, and while the murmur is a cry, the cry becomes a shout, the shout of thunder until the whole Zambezi waters pour into the earth's side, agitating under infinite spray mists, pounding the world's floor. Wrapped in this liquid turmoil, who can say? Which is the mighty echo? Which the spray? I knew my married life was over. Strangely, the experience of the Victoria Falls gave me courage to endure the difficult years to come. The falls became to me a symbol of spiritual strength.
There's just such a feeling of power and energy and life. I can understand where Muriel came to the falls, her husband's unwell, uncommunicative, belligerent. She thinks this will make a difference to him, and she comes here and thinks, I'm going to leave my marriage. There's something about this that gives her a kind of spiritual uplifting and gives her actually a lot of confidence. The Victoria Falls and the Zambezi River were an inspiration for Muriel Spark long after she left Africa. And she drew on the river for this wonderful short story, The Seraph and the Zambezi.
In the winter of 1951, the Observer newspaper held a short story competition with a cash prize of £250. For Muriel Spark, a struggling and still unknown writer, it was a turning point.
I wrote it in 3 days. I'd finished it on a Saturday. I had to go and I went and borrow some typing paper, which I didn't have. I borrowed some from a shop. I said, haven't you any typing paper? Just, all I want is, 5 pages. So he gave me them.
And did you expect to win?
I should have been more surprised than I was, because I knew it was good quality, but I didn't think I'd win because it was so unusual. It was for that very reason that it did win, of course.
It's slightly supernatural, it's slightly surreal. You don't know whether it's some sort of hallucination or whether there's some revelation going on. But it's a very striking story, and I'm not surprised that she won.
Of all the periods of Muriel Spark's long and varied life, the decade leading up to the publication of this story is the hardest for me to get to grips with. Muriel had resolved to leave her husband, but did she foresee the chain of events that would lead to another, more difficult separation?
Exactly 2 years after Muriel and Oswald were married, war broke out, and all civilian transport to Britain ended. Her husband joined the army. Muriel spent the next few years moving from city to city, always taking Robin with her, looking after Robin, writing poetry, and taking the odd office job.
But when the divorce came through, custody of Robin was granted to his father. Muriel placed their child in a boarding school in Gwelo, where she knew at least he'd be safe. She went to South Africa, and from there got a place on a troop ship bound for Britain. Many of Muriel Spark's papers are now kept in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh.
Goodness me, God. Gwelo, 1612-1943. Dear Mrs. Spark, Sonny is very well. Sonny was the name they had for Robin. And he is growing fast and looking cheerful. Best wishes for Christmas and New Year. And this is so interesting that she's kept this. she kept this all her life, because this was an incredibly important event in Muriel's life, leaving Robin behind.
Muriel arrived in London in the spring of 1944, in the final months of the Second World War. She found work in a semi-covert department in the Foreign Office, run by a journalist called Sefton Delmer. He produced a fake radio station to broadcast rumour and misinformation to the German public.
It's been said that she was a secretary, but I don't think she was just a secretary. Was she a code breaker? I don't think she was a code breaker. I never saw her do a crossword puzzle, for example. But she would be the ideal person to come up with stories that would have a sort of double think aspect to them.
Well, I think that working in any secret department of the state must have some effect on your life and possibly your art. If you're a writer, you just need to think of Graham Greene and John le Carré, who were also spooks, as Muriel Spark, I suppose, could call herself a spook of sorts. My feeling is that if she had done anything more, audacious or contributing to the war effort, we would have heard about it.
In fact, the closest we get to this experience in her fiction is in the novel The Hothouse by the East River.
What they are engaged with in this particular compound is known as black propaganda and psychological warfare. The compound is reputed to be the most intelligent outfit of the war. The source from which these reputations have arisen will never be found.
When Muriel Spark first came to London in the spring of 1944, she stayed here in 82 Lancaster Gate, a home for ladies from good families of modest means who were obliged to pursue an occupation in London. The Helena Club became the May of Tech Club in her novel, The Girls of Slender Means.
The May of Tech Club exists for the pecuniary convenience and social protection of ladies of slender means below the age of 30 years who are obliged to reside apart from their families in order to follow an occupation in London. As they realised themselves in varying degrees, few people alive at the time were more delightful, more ingenious, more movingly lovely, and, as it might happen, more savage than the girls of slender means.
She's very polite, she's very douce, she's very Edinburgh, she's very drawing room, very ladylike, but it is this ladylike as a scalpel. Underneath it, there's always this little glitter. She is looking inside people immediately. She is not fooled by anybody. Which sounds very judgmental, and it's not really judgmental, it's just people are a mess. People are internally contradictory. People lie to themselves, never mind to other people. People are deluded about who they really are, which is just true, but it's quite an unusual viewpoint.
When the war ended, Muriel was able to bring her son Robin to Scotland to stay with her parents in Edinburgh, while she struggled to make her way in literary London. Her luck seemed to be turning when, in 1947, she was appointed General Secretary of the Poetry Society and editor of its magazine, The Poetry Review.
I was amazed at the struggle for power within a thing called the Poetry Society. You know, it was rather like politics, or something I'd read about in the Roman Empire. I'd never experienced in such a cutthroat affair.
Muriel held her ground in a series of battles, including one with the birth control pioneer Mary Stopes.
I forget what got her down in the first place. Maybe I turned down one of her poems. And she wanted to know why I'd got a divorce, and I told her to mind her own business. She, of all people, she had birth control clinics all over the place. She was the advanced woman of her time. I wrote in my autobiography, I used to wish that her mother had thought of birth control first.
By the early 1950s, Muriel had put her sharp mind to better purpose. She earned her living writing literary reviews and biographies. Not yet a novelist, her writing style in these first published works already has a distinctively Sparkian tone. This is still evident in the earliest filmed record of Muriel Spark, a 1961 BBC film about Emily Bronte.
I don't think that Emily herself ever had a love affair or thought of marriage. None of the Bronte records suggest it, and there aren't any legends. But she was a passionate woman. All her passion and all the intensity of emotion that was in her nature went into her writings and all her imaginative work. And she was content just to be a spinster of this parish.
Although living alone, Muriel's own life wasn't quite that of a spinster.
I think the area of Muriel Spark's early life that most intrigues me is this relationship and love affair she had with this man called Derek Stamford, who was a kind of jobbing hack writer, basically. And everything one reads about Stamford seems to indicate that he was a completely undistinguished person. And I cannot see why the beautiful and incandescent Muriel Spark should have been attracted to him.
A lot of women prefer the rascals of life to the good men. And maybe that's it, that I know I'm a very bad picker.
Did you feel betrayed by the men that you loved?
Sometimes I was betrayed, not only feel. I was really betrayed.
In later years, when Spark was a successful writer, Derek Stamford sold her love letters and published his own inaccurate and unflattering portrait of her life. But she had started to keep her own meticulous records.
Almost every letter I have received, every note I have made, every checkbook, every book of accounts, every appointments book, lists of names and addresses, accountants, lawyers, turf accountants, all and everything I have conserved in a vast archive.
The reason why she kept everything was to be able to point to evidence, to say, look, you say this happened, but actually this is what happened. You say I was in such and such a place on a certain date, but no, this shows I wasn't. I was in another place. So she became obsessed with being able to correct lies.
One of the documents in the archive points to another reason why she might have wanted to keep everything.
The Manager, Ministry of National Insurance, 21st of May, 1954. I would like to appeal against the decision of the National Insurance Officer in disallowing my claim for national health benefit for the period 20th of January to 3rd of April, 1954. Briefly, the trouble was that I began to imagine secret codes in everything I read, and so lost a grip on reality.
The reason why I failed to claim within the prescribed period was that my illness was a mental breakdown, the nature of which prevented me from grasping a great many objective facts. Objective facts. And when she writes Curriculum Vitae, she comes back to that again. She said, one thing I've always known about my well-ordered archive was that it would stand by me, the silent, objective evidence of truth, should I ever need it. Now, the objective truth in here was that Muriel had a mental breakdown.
In order to stave off hunger, Muriel had been taking an appetite suppressant. It caused her to hallucinate. Words on the page rearranged themselves. She thought that T.S. Eliot was communicating with her in code. Spark used this experience to conceive her first novel.
Naturally, you can't construct a novel while you're having a nervous breakdown or while it's on. But as soon as I was well enough and cured, I wrote this novel, which described more or less my experiences except my experience had been that words were jumbled up on the page to read, whereas that you couldn't do in a novel. I don't see how technically you could get round that easily. So I made it into the protagonist of the novel hearing voices.
What on earth are they up to at this time of night? Caroline wondered. Then it began again. Tap, tappity-tap, the typewriter. And again the voices. Caroline ran out onto the landing, for it seemed quite certain that the sound came from that direction. No one was there. The chanting reached her as soon as she returned to her room, with these words exactly. What on earth are they up to at this time of night? Caroline wondered.
The very notion that a bunch of people who, in a novel, imagine that they're living a very ordinary life, one of them can suddenly hear the construction of her own fiction happening round her in the very dingy Kensington room in which she's, working on a book about the form in the modern novel. It's a brilliant game of the spirit, jeu d'esprit. It's a brilliant joke. And she wrote The Comforters at exactly the same time as, all the angry young men were doing their rooms at the top, and the kitchen sink drama was the mode of the time. A writer like Spark looks at that, knows that realism is only real if you know that a novel in your hand is a novel. This is just an extraordinary originality.
Well, with a novel, you have to, first of all, make up your mind who is writing the book, because every novel has a hidden narrator, not necessarily the person of the author.
At the same time that our characters are coming to terms with the fact that they have an author, Muriel Spark was grappling with the idea of her own maker. In parallel with becoming a novelist, Muriel Spark became a Roman Catholic.
I didn't have a fixed religion as a child. It was neither 100% Jewish home or Anglican of my mother's or Presbyterian of my school. It was, although my parents were very religious insofar as they all believed in God. They both believed in God. My family believed in God. And this seemed to be the natural thing. I tried to become an Anglican, and I found I didn't believe a word of it. And then I was reading Cardinal Newman, and so I just drifted into it like that.
Yes, you drifted, but you were seeking something as well.
Yes.
You positively went out to find a religion.
Yes. Largely, I'm still a Catholic because I can't believe anything else. I'd often like to, but I can't.
And you find it a satisfying religion for you now?
No, but I can't believe anything else. Perhaps the truth isn't satisfying.
In her novels, she often homes in on that gap between truth and faith. In A Far Cry from Kensington, the characters have been drawn into belief in a miracle cure known as the box.
It was generally established that while the box had no scientific basis for its diagnostic claims, the practitioners and their followers might be perfectly sincere. I dare say that from the point of view of a visitor from outer space, the box is no more ridiculous than a Catholic catechism or the Mass.
God is the constant character in all her fiction. It might not be always the main character, but I think God is always there. Because from Muriel's point of view, God is always there. And she couldn't have written the book she did without believing that.
But did she ever talk to you about that belief in God?
Yes, she did. And, it was a complicated business because she was always testing her own beliefs. She was always asking herself, am I right? Is this what I think?
Is that Mr. Godfrey Colston?
It is.
You're making a mistake. Dame Letty isn't here. Or perhaps you want to talk to my wife.
There's no mistake. The message is for you, Mr. Colston.
Memento Mori, literally, remember you two must die, is a book where you take a small group of characters. It's a closed world. It's a group of elderly people. Very few of the characters are under 70. There's a mysterious voice on the phone telling them to remember that they must die. On the face of it, it seems like a straightforward mystery. But, of course, being Spark, it becomes something very different from that.
Each character gets the same telephone message. They interpret the words differently, depending on their faith.
Mrs. Charmian Colston.
Yes, this is Charmian Colston. Are you a reporter?
No.
Then how may I help you?
Remember, you must die.
Thank you. At my age, there are many things I don't remember. But that is not one of them. Goodbye.
I probably will never read that book again because I'm now too old and it's just scary. It's basically a big sign that says your body will collapse, your mind will go to wet biscuits, and then you'll die. If you're lucky, you'll die soon. She understands that life is brief. And she's always hardest on the people who have not got over that, who have not grasped that.
Her own life was changing rapidly. The prime of Miss Jean Brodie was a huge publishing success. It would become a hit Broadway play and later an Oscar-winning film. Muriel Spark had immortalised her Edinburgh in print, but she was no longer at home in the city of her birth.
When Muriel came back in April of 1962 to Edinburgh and stayed here at the North British Hotel, as it was called then, she came back for a very sad reason. She came back because her father was dying. She sat by the telephone and she waited for a call to go and visit him.
In those days, I experienced an inpouring of love for the place of my birth, which I'm aware was psychologically connected with my love for my father and with the exiled sensation of occupying a hotel room, which was really meant for strangers. My frequent visits to Edinburgh for a few weeks at a time throughout the years have been the visits of an exile in heart and mind. It is a place where I could not hope to be understood. Nevertheless, it is the place where I was first understood.
The call did come at 4 o'clock in the morning to tell Muriel that her father had died. She was 44 years old, exactly at the midpoint in her own life. She had published 6 novels and had 16 more to come. The next chapter would start with another move and another reinvention, this time to New York. She had established a relationship with the New Yorker magazine.
The New Yorker offered me an office to work in, so all I need to have a couple of rooms in a hotel, a sort of service flat. And I went every morning to the office.
From her window, she could see the Time Life sign on the Rockefeller Center.
When it says time, I write. When it says life, I want to go out.
Nobody knew about the seedy bedsits and the horrible love affair with the literary hack. And she was able to present herself as a very glamorous, well-dressed, sophisticated, successful writer. And I suspect the room kind of swirled around her.
Yet even the bright lights and bustle of New York City failed to hold Muriel for long, and she began seeking out another, more European way of life. This time in the eternal city, Rome. The photographs of Muriel Spark taken in her Rome years show a woman transformed. She's 52 in this photo. If anything, she looks more youthful than she did at 25.
I think people who reinvent themselves in general are escaping something, whether it's their past or whether it's a sense of themselves or whether it's a sense of being unhappy with the baggage that they've been given as an individual from their family or their upbringing, their education. And so I see Muriel Spark as falling into that category, somebody who had been handed a sort of classic Scottish, Jewish, Edinburgh persona with all the expectations that arrived thereby, and had decided, I'm not going to follow that road, I'm going to be entirely different. And so I think as the forking paths appeared before her, whether it was wartime London or New York or Italy, she chose them. But I think it's a flight from the self or a flight from the past that makes people do that.
I'm fascinated by this period in Muriel's life and what Rome meant to her. Agnes Crawford is a city guide who can show me the hidden places of Muriel Spark's Rome. This ancient city contains many secrets.
So if we look out here, we can see the windows with the closed shutters, which the porter of the building informs us was the salon, which formed part of Muriel's apartment.
Those two windows there.
That's right, with the closed shutters under the crenellations. And it was the largest room of her grand apartment, which she decided not to even attempt to furnish. So she inhabited a small corner of it, she said, and it was large enough that she would host great parties. And undoubtedly, while she's here, her social circle changes. The public image is published, and that leads to her nomination for the first Booker Prize, and it's here that she's filmed for an interview for the BBC.
Is there something about the new film world of Rome and the old stones of Rome that attracted you?
No, I think that the history of Rome has always been like that. Rome is ancient enough to be a good setting for a very modern and very transitory set.
In the novel she had written, the husband of a famous film star orchestrates his suicide in the catacombs in the place of martyrdom.
It seemed to me the sort of place where a vindictive type of suicide would take place because there had been cruelty here. The place gives me the creeps, which I kind of like.
I think Rome is undoubtedly very rich, not only in life, but in death. You know, a building like this has seen it all.
Yeah.
Rome has seen it all, and Romans have seen it all.
Yeah.
And very rarely are they, to be particularly perturbed. And if you combine that sort of ancient depth of history with the sort of constant presence that characterized the sort of Dolce Vita period of celebrity in the city, famous people were to be found absolutely everywhere.
And this dawning age of celebrity was given the Spark treatment in her novel, The Public Image.
These sunny glossies of Italy beamingly scandalised the just and the unjust alike, churning up the splendour of their wickedness weekly. The range of emotions was as grand opera, but no subtler.
Rome was a rich source of inspiration for Muriel, but also a distraction. When her writing needed focus, she escaped to this exclusive private hospital in the hills above Rome. Being genuinely ill was not a requirement for admission. The cloistered environment had provided anonymity and refuge to popes and film stars alike. Muriel completed 3 of her novels here, including The Driver's Seat, later made into a film starring Elizabeth Taylor.
A small crowd has gathered, waiting for embarkation. Lise surveys her fellow passengers one by one, very carefully, but not in a manner to provoke their attention. She moves and mingles as if with dreamy feet and legs, but quite plainly from her eyes, her mind is not dreamy, as she absorbs each face, each dress, each suit of clothes which will accompany her on the flight now boarding at gate 14. She will be found tomorrow morning dead from multiple stab wounds, her wrists bound with a silk scarf and her ankles bound with a man's necktie, in the grounds of an empty villa, in a park of the foreign city to which she is travelling on the flight now boarding at gate 14. I do still remember quite vividly that moment of shock when you discover at the beginning of chapter 3 that she's going to be murdered. And that's just like, you know, what? How are we going to get from here to there? And it is one of those very Sparkian moments where the world just tips on its axis, and the things that you thought you knew about this character are not going to lead to the place you thought they might lead. You know, the first couple of chapters you think, oh, she's going to go off and somehow this odd woman is going to find love or something. You should know better, really, reading Muriel Spark. But
I don't think anyone could know if she knew herself what she was looking for until she found it. But always groping in a certain direction, she was looking for her killer.
Then you read on, looking at every character you encounter through a very different lens. Is this going to be the one? Is this going to be the one? She's looking for a particular person, but is that actually going to be somebody completely different who does her in? Where are we going?
What I did there was one of these flash forwards, because I think that's far more subtle than ordinary suspense, to just give away the ending. And the reader is really involved to see how it happened.
This BBC interview is its own flash forward, of course. Muriel is 78. She's being filmed at the house in Tuscany where she lived for the last 30 years of her life.
She moved on from Rhodesia, she moved on from London, she moved on from New York, she moved on from Rome. Who knew Muriel in all those early years would have ever thought that she would spend, say, the last 30 years of her life living in a remote rural place in the middle of the Italian countryside?
Because Muriel kept absolutely everything, in the files at the National Library of Scotland, we can trace the first appearance of a figure who would bring sanctuary and stability to her restless life.
Monday the 15th of January 1968, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m, 4 hours at 1700 lira. Tuesday 16th Jan, 3 hours, 4.5 hours. Total 28,050 lira. Signed Penelope Jardine. This was the start of a relationship that lasted the next 40 years. And it's a simple invoice for some secretarial work. Who knew this was the start of a lifelong friendship?
Of all the people who ever had a chance to know the real Muriel Spark, and I wish I'd been one of them, Penelope Jardine is perhaps the person who got to know her best.
Oh, Penelope. Hello, how are you? Very well, how are you? Nice to meet you.
I'll show you the bell, the famous bell for breakfast, lunch, tea and dinner here.
So what?
It was in my studio in Rome. And when Muriel was working upstairs, I would ring the bell and say lunch is ready. Without disturbing her, so to speak, was the idea.
In the summer of 1975, while working on her 14th novel, Muriel felt that now familiar need for escape and peace to work. Penelope Jardine, an artist who had worked as Muriel's secretary in Rome, was now living in a converted church in Tuscany.
Muriel was writing her book, The Takeover, that summer, and it was getting hotter and hotter, and she had someone to stay, and it was very distracting, and one thing and another, and she got a block. She couldn't write anymore. And so I was ringing her up about something, and she said, can I come up? Or I said, would you like to come up? I don't know which way. And she said, oh, it's an idea. Come and fetch me. So
come and fetch her.
Well, she couldn't drive. And so I went and picked her up, and she stayed ever since. That was it. she found it was, you know, useful, I think, to have a companion that she could talk to, somebody who understood what she did, who could drive a car and cook an egg.
So was that...
She was totally devoted to her work. That was all that really mattered. Everything else had to fit in and fit around.
So she had an extraordinary work ethic. I mean...
She used to tell people in interviews that she would, you know, write in the morning, or she would get up early, or she'd do 2 hours, or it was completely untrue. She never did any of those things. She would think for a year, probably, about a book, and then it would be written in a few weeks. She had to have the title, and she wrote the book from the title, I think, in a way. She had often the ending. She'd type up a little piece of paper with just the ending. The last sentence.
Before she started?
Yeah. And then there'd be a few more notes on the way. Amazing it was, most extraordinary.
Usually, I write on these notebooks. These are exercise books, same as I used as a child. They're from James Thin of Southbridge, Edinburgh, and I send for them, and they send me a dozen at a time. And I begin at the beginning. I write my name on the first page. I write my name, and then I write the title, then I write my name, then I turn over and I write the title of the book, I write chapter 1, and then I write on. And when it's, I leave a space so I can make alterations as I go along, but I don't revise it afterwards. And then it goes to the typist, and she types it, and I revise that, and that's the book. That's finished.
And she never corrected anything, hardly ever.
But you were typing these up, and did you do corrections?
Oh, no. Of course I didn't correct. I wouldn't have dared correct it, no. What do you mean?
What I mean is, for example, would there be a comma out of place or a full stop out of place?
Oh, no. Anyway, I wouldn't have been allowed to say, put a comma there. Because every comma meant something. It meant a breath of... It was all rhythm. Muriel liked to spend hot evenings in August like we have now, being driven somewhere, like up, you know, to the hills, and she'd be thinking of her book the whole time.
Penelope, I cannot get over these. How neat they all are. This is like a piece of artwork.
Most of Muriel's vast archive has been packed and sent to the National Library of Scotland. It falls to Penelope to deal with the rest.
All the poems of Muriel Spark, podcast via the New Yorker. So you're still cataloguing?
Lots of dead ends.
Memento Mori with Maggie Smith, collections on television. Brodie the musical.
Which never happened. Somebody says, have we got a translation of that in that language? I can't even read them.
But you know where it is?
They're in Chinese.
And is all this uncatalogued?
Most of this over here is just pending.
Will there ever be anything that was never published? You know, because even when Muriel was working on her last book...
It was only 5 pages or something.
But that was never published?
No.
Do you have it?
Yes, I can't remember where I've put it. I have it somewhere and I tucked away, yeah. It's called Destiny. Some things have been here waiting since about 2008. I haven't answered them yet. They answer themselves after a while.
Eventually it goes away.
Yeah. The hats. Would you like to see the hats?
I'd love to see Muriel's hats.
I want to see the hats.
Wow.
We don't answer the phone.
But I love that because it's got, so basically it's got, this goes at the back and then the veil goes over the front.
Looks great on you. Would you like to keep it for your next wedding? Guess what? I've got Muriel's hat on.
This is part of this vast archive.
Oh, yeah. Can't wait to get rid of it.
Does
There
it
was
feel
something in that.
sometimes? Does it actually feel sometimes like a weight?
I don't want it to be a kind of, you know, what do you call it? Memory lane stuff. This house, it is slightly already.
And as things go to the National Library, does that feel like a weight is being lifted?
Wonderful, yeah. Yes, it does. Yeah.
But I suppose in a way, you are the keeper of the flame.
I feel like blowing it out sometimes. do go away.
Yeah.
You know, because it's quite a burden in a way. To have to think, what am I going to do with that?
Yeah. What am I going to do with this hat?
What am I going to do?
Yeah. Do you think that each of you felt that the relationship that you two had was the most important in your lives?
Oh, no. I shouldn't think so. I don't think so, no.
But you were so close for so many years.
Yeah, it was kind of fairly constant, I suppose. I think our whole relationship was one of sort of freedom in a way. She was free and I was free, but we both had this creative side that had to be understood.
That idea of freedom, I think, is a very interesting one.
It's you have to have. With anybody, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to ask this because it's a matter of record, and people always put this exactly the wrong way. So if I just ask you this, was it a relationship that was more than a deep friendship?
No, it was not. I know what you're asking me. No. No. It was just that we had good understanding, I think. There were a lot side of her I didn't really know at all. I don't think you ever know everybody. Anybody, actually.
I had persuaded her to come to Edinburgh to appear at the International Book Festival because I thought time was running out. She was 86 and I was worried that she might not last or be well enough to come again. It was a very emotional day. Tickets were much sought after. They'd sold out within minutes of being put on sale. She'd said to me that she was going to read from a new short story and a poem or whatever. And I said, no, you can't do that. And she said, well, why not? I said, well, they've come to hear Jean Brodie. She said, they have to hear you say it. They have to hear the words. And she read it. It was incredible.
I have frequently told you, and the holidays just past have convinced me, that my prime has truly begun. One's prime is elusive. You little girls, when you grow up, must be on the alert to recognize your prime at whatever time of your life it may occur. You must then live it to the full.